Yep, welcome to this live question and answer session, which is part of the course on the fairy tales of H.C. Andersen, as we call him in Denmark. We look forward to answering and discussing the many interesting questions you've posted, and you're welcome to post more during the session if you feel like it. I am Jakob Bøgel, and at my side we've got Torsten.
Torsten Bøgh Thomsen, yes. Very nice to meet you.
Yeah, so we'll go straight ahead. And the first question is from Corinne D. On a comments thread in week 1, a couple of us had speculated that perhaps HCA could have been on the autism spectrum after a fellow learner had brought up Andersen's awkward visit with Dickens. He did appear to experience difficulty with social interactions, as well as exhibit some other qualifiers on the spectrum. Or could it have just been that he appeared awkward, as he never quite got the hang of the vocabulary, behavior, and etiquette specific to the upper class, and therefore struggled socially as a result? Any thoughts? Thank you in advance.
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think from time to time we get these questions that address the inner life and the mental life and sometimes even the mental stability of Hans Christian Andersen. And it's a very difficult question to answer, really, because first of all, you can say that these kind of psychological diagnoses weren't actually invented in the 19th century. So it wouldn't make much sense to say about a person in the 19th century, was he or she an autist or not. However, I can see why people would think so, because we do hear a lot about his social awkwardness, about his kind of unstable approach to other people socially, but I'm not sure that it's necessarily autism. I think it's more an eccentricity that he had towards other people, and he could come off as, well, we know that he could come off as quite eccentric to other people, and very intense. Especially when it comes to the visit at Dickens, it is, as I know, it is true that that did not have a very good ending. I think that also had a lot to do with the fact that Andersen apparently overstayed his welcome at the Dickens house by almost a couple of weeks, I think, and that he wasn't very adept in the English language. So communication between Dickens and Andersen was also a bit difficult. But he did have a reputation generally for being quite high-strung and quite high maintenance, and he was a very emotional character. But I don't really know. But I know that he never received a formal diagnosis.
No, he didn't. As you say, such a diagnosis wasn't invented at the time. But we have to stress we are not experts on autism in any way. But therefore we do not know the sort of compatibility between autism and a sense of figurative language, double meanings, irony, and so on. But all we can say is that Andersen was really an expert when it comes to double meanings and irony and figurative language.
Yeah.
And if that's not traits you would normally connect with autism, then he wasn't an autist.
Also, I might add that as far as we know, and from the diaries and what he wrote about his own writing, he was very much aware of what he was doing. So I would advise against reading his authorship as some kind of symptom of any kind of illness necessarily, because he was a very he was an artist, and he was very aware of being an artist, and he was very, very aware of what he did, and he edited his own manuscripts again and again, and was very careful. So he was, if you think that if you might think that he was this kind of pathological writer who couldn't do anything but write or wrote on some kind of I don't know passion, then that might be true. But it was also a very intellectual, very self-aware, artistic, meticulous kind of work that he did all the time. So it wasn't this on the spur that he was creating these things out of some kind of mania or anything like that.
No,
so
that's prefiguring a later question, but he wasn't a kind of the romantic genius in that sense.
No.
The myth of the romantic genius,
Yeah.
Genius just pouring out masterpieces spontaneously.
No. From some kind of divine imagination or madness. That was that wasn't the case.
Not at all. No. And it's also the part. Well, I think we both agree that he did get the hang of the vocabulary and behavior and etiquette. He was a very apt reader of social interaction.
Yeah.
But I think he always felt strange, alienated to some extent.
Yeah.
And his own explanation would be that he was always made to feel that his origins were humble.
Yeah.
Whether that's fair or not to people around him, but that was his own experience.
Yeah. And to the extent that he was a social, I wouldn't call him a social outcast, but on the margins or somewhat of an outsider in the social life in Denmark, it was because of his background and not because he wasn't polite enough or experienced in the manners and etiquette, because he knew those social codes very well and was able even to manipulate them at some points and exploit them and make them a theme in some of his fairy tales.
About them.
Exactly. So he was kind of a social chameleon. He really adapted to this kind of. He knew the bourgeois etiquette in the society that he was living in. So the next question is from Rosanelli F, who writes, I don't know if I understood well what you said in the video, that it is not a psychological development. Why not? In my opinion, every fairy tale can show a particular psychological development. Can you explain this better, please? Thank you very much.
It might be a video with me that this question addresses, so I'll try to provide an answer if I can. Well, it very much depends, of course, on what do you mean by psychological development. Psychology, when we use the word psychology, it's a fairly modern invention from the late 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, Freud, Jung, and so on. And the idea about individuation, for example, it's a fairly modern idea. I know that fairy tales are used, read, interpreted in such a context, but to me that's kind of anachronistic. The idea of individuation, of individual development, is not an idea you can find reflected in should we say folktale culture. It's a much later idea fashioned in our civilization. So I think you should just have to be very careful. I think folktales are very much about existential situations in life, maturing, and so on, like myths, and in that sense they are psychological, but in a very broad sense. You cannot kind of connect any deep psychology or deep psychological dimension to a character in a folktale. It's what's in an English context is referred to as a completely flat character.
Yeah.
And most of Andersen's characters in the fairy tales and the stories are pretty flat. It's not always the case, but very often it is the case.
Yeah. So would you say that in the folktale it's more, because obviously there is a lot of the times there are some kind of developments throughout the folktale, of course, but it's more like an inner fixed character trait that is making sure that the prince gets the princess or something like that.
Yeah.
It's not a psychological development.
Characters don't change psychologically.
No, they don't go through some kind of inner development.
No, and you can find that in some of Andersen's tales.
Yeah,
not all of them, but that's an alien dimension when you discuss folk tales.
Yeah,
and I guess we can return a bit to this question when we get to the question about the actantial model, because they're kind of relevant to each other, those two questions. So we'll get back to it. Yes, and then it's a question from Andrei Negreshny, who writes that I'm a philology student and currently writing a work on morality in Andersen's tales. It's very interesting. On the SDU Andersen Center's website, there is, among others, a text by Niels Ingvarsen entitled "I Do Not Understand Anything," the presumable Andersen's next to last words. The author uses these words as a kind of outline in which views expressed in Andersen's texts can be understood and summarized. If one looks at the body of Andersen's tales, one will see that a worldview is hardly in place, for tale contradicts tale. Of course, Andersen expressed opinions and revealed attitudes that, more or less, remained the same throughout his career, but they hardly add up to a worldview. Andersen's tales may, however, be seen as embodying a 37-year quest for making sense out of life. My question is, concerning moral and ethic problems explored in Andersen's tales, would you say that there are some definite moral views expressed there? And if yes, then how would you describe these? Or do you agree with the opinion quoted above, and the distinctive quality of morality in Andersen's tales is that he rather raises questions than answers them? Thank you.
That's a very interesting question, and also something that we are debating a lot about at the Hans Christian Andersen Center. I think my short answer would be that this raising questions is perhaps an ethics in itself.
I totally agree.
Yeah, so if you by morality mean some kind of fixed worldview, which is normative and which can generate clear moral messages, then no, I don't think that the work of Andersen contains that. It is actually a more, I would say, more modern concept or ethical worldview that you can read out of the works of Hans Christian Andersen. So actually opening up ethical or thematizing ethical issues and moral dilemmas is in itself an ethics in Andersen's works. So you are not fed some fixed or given some fixed life lessons that you can put to direct use, but you are asked, how is this dilemma relevant to your situation, or what does it feel like to be torn between two choices? So it's those kinds of ethical dilemmas that the characters in Andersen's fairy tales are put in.
Yeah, Andersen will often, thematize and present the reader with dilemmas.
Yeah,
exactly. And I think it's a very good phrase in Ingvarsen's text that a tale will contradict a tale.
Yeah,
or tale contradicts tale. That's the case in certain instances, and very deliberately from Andersen, to be sure.
Yeah.
Which means that it will be up to the reader to address this almost contrapuntal relationship between two tales.
Yeah.
And that's in itself ethical.
Yeah.
And I think it's the job of good literature to do exactly that. To place the reader in a position where the reader will have to make up his or her mind about dilemmas in such a way.
I think we will also get back to this during the course when we get to The Little Mermaid and the story of a mother who are filled with ethical choices, and the protagonists have to choose in some very, very hard ethical, or opposed with some very, very hard ethical, difficult ethical dilemmas. So I think we will get back to this during the course.
And there will be some heated discussions about the red shoes.
Also, yes, also
because it appears to be so harsh in its condemnation of the main character.
Yeah.
But once you really start reading the story, all sorts of questions pop up.
Yeah.
Questions which question this harsh condemnation.
Yeah. So it's not just differences in messages between the fairy tales. Also within a fairy tale, there might often be some kind of tension or some kind, because on the surface, the red shoes seems like overtly moralizing, but if you dig a little bit deeper, it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
And I don't think we'll spoil it any further by going into any of those. But yeah, I hope that answered your question.
Yes.
Then we have another question from Andrei Negresny, asking, I understand that so far mostly questions about structure and genre were explored in the course, and my question concerns rather contents of Hans Christian Andersen's literature. However, the answer to it, if possible, will be appreciated immensely. And then Andrei wants to especially express my gratitude for this unique opportunity to ask a direct question to specialists on Andersen.
You're welcome.
You're very welcome, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, it appears to be maybe most of all an afterthought to the question we've just discussed.
Yeah.
But I think I would like to just comment on the formulation that so far the course has been mostly about structure and genre, and that the question we've discussed was more about the contents. I would just like to say that whenever we focus on questions of structure and genre, we're not interested in making models fit or to shoehorn the tales into some models. What we're interested is the cases where the shoehorn doesn't work, and where the tale doesn't fit the model, where we think that is a deliberate artistic choice or move made by Andersen, and that's the case again and again.
Yeah.
So questions about structure and genre are only interesting as keys to content. But you might address matters of content that way that you wouldn't otherwise be able to address.
Yeah, I completely agree. I could also add that this course might be heavy in the beginning on questions of structure and genre, and that is because we want to get some tools in place that we can discuss these fairy tales with, and also I think it's fitting that we start out, because this is also quite in respect to Andersen's authorship. This course is also quite chronological. So we start with some of the earlier fairy tales where Andersen is playing more with the folk tale as a genre, and gradually, as he finds his own form, or rather the breaking out of the mold that is the folk tale, then I think we'll start focusing more on the thematical content and the ethical dilemmas and issues raised in the fairy tales. So I think there's a progression where we start out being quite structural, and then that's kind of eased up.
Yeah, but questions about content already explode when it comes to the tinderbox, of course.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is really in many ways a horrible story.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you look at what happens.
Yeah.
Also extremely interesting, of course.
Yeah.
For that very reason. Yeah. So then there is a question from Glennis Brown. It is said that Jenny Lind, the soprano, was the inspiration for the Nightingale. However, there are similarities with Keats' Ode to a Nightingale. Was this a homage to Keats or a declaration of unrequited love for Jenny Lind?
That's a good question. I've heard the Jenny Lind story many times before. I think that it is also admitted by himself as an inspiration. I don't really know, but it's a connection that is often made because she was called a nightingale.
Yes.
However, I think a more direct inspiration for this fairy tale is the fact that the amusement park Tivoli opened in Copenhagen shortly before the publication of the Nightingale. And these Tivoli gardens you may have heard of, but it is an amusement park in the middle of the capital of Denmark, Copenhagen, and it features because the 19th century was also very much occupied with Orientalism. It features a lot of its structures or buildings are Orientalist, so Chinese or Indian. And allegedly, it was after his first visit to the Tivoli Gardens that he went back home directly and wrote on the Nightingale.
In this very instance, poured it out.
Yeah, in this particular instance, he actually may have poured it out directly.
That's what he writes in his that it was like boom.
Yeah, he was very inspired by these Tivoli Gardens, and then went home and wrote the Nightingale. But there is so much more. The thing where I'm struggling to connect the Jenny Lind story with the Nightingale is that I think we only have this coincidence of the name, because this is by no means a love story in any way.
No.
Or at least there are so many other things that are way more important in that fairy tale.
And again, it seems to be such a very clear-cut dichotomy, because between what is natural and what is artificial, and once you start reading carefully again, it becomes much more complicated. And the more amazing if he really did write it just in one go.
Because it's a very complex story. That is, of course, about nature and culture, which seems, as you say, very dichotomous. But if you close read it, they spill over into each other all the time. And the natural or biological nightingale is it is actually, as you also write in one of your books, it is the emperor that is insisting on this clear dichotomy between the natural and the cultural, whereas the biological nightingale is continuously saying that is not the point. That's not the point. Your crown is also worth something. Your tears, the tears of an emperor is worth something. So yeah, there are, if you close read that, especially towards the ending, the conversation between the biological nightingale and the emperor is much more complex than a clear dichotomy between nature and culture. But I don't see a love story anywhere in that fairy tale.
But I think we can say that this is probably not a homage to Keats.
Oh yeah, no.
Because similarities or not, I think it's fairly unlikely. Again, Andersen's limited abilities in English.
Yeah.
For Andersen to be familiar with a poem by a poet in the English language, it would have to be translated into German.
Yeah.
I don't know that about Ode to a Nightingale.
No.
But I guess it was not so popular that it was translated into German immediately.
No. And I think,
whereas Andersen, he was very well versed in Shakespeare.
Yeah.
And he read Shakespeare in German translations, and Shakespeare was translated, of course.
Do you know about Walter Scott? Because
he was very, very popular. So
yeah,
he was, I think, translated
into Danish. Or
at least into German.
Yeah,
maybe into Danish as well.
Because I remember, somehow I kind of remember that Andersen saying in one of his autobiographies that he read him as a boy. But I'm not quite sure about that. But it seems, or as a big boy, a teenager perhaps, and then he might have known German by that time.
I think he knew. I'm not absolutely certain, but I think Andersen could speak and probably read German at at a quite tender age.
Yeah.
And Odense, it's so much the south of Denmark that there might have been some kind of influence from the German language.
Yeah.
And we know that he read books aloud to a widow, and that's where he kind of met some of the classics of world literature.
Yeah.
Some of them must have been German translations. So we could read German.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why German was such a big language in Denmark at this point in time was, among other things, well, most of the important or influential philosophy came from Germany at this point in time, but also at that point in time, Denmark also included some of the provinces in Germany that are now, of course, German, but the northern German provinces. And there was a university, I believe, that educated all of the government officials. So the language, the second language, at least among the royalty and the government officials, was German.
Yeah.
So German was a very important language to know of in Denmark at this time, way more important than English.
Yeah. Which nobody spoke English.
No.
Only very few.
Yeah. So, Lodevik Janauta is asking, I would like to have an answer to the following two questions. In one of his many articles on Andersen, the Dutch author Godfried Bomans writes, quote, "Every year when the birthday of Hans Christian Andersen is celebrated, we are too late. Although we must admit that Andersen saw the light of day in 1805, yet he was not born on the 2nd, but on the 1st of April. However, he did not consider that date, April Fool's Day or All Fool's Day, in accordance with the dignity of his authorship, and therefore changed his birthday in his autobiography, The Story of My Life. This detail is typical of Andersen because he thereby expresses the desire to make a fairy tale of his own life." So, unquote. My first question, is Bomans right or is he wrong? For example, is there a birth certificate with the official right date on it? And then the second question is, in the timeline, it is mentioned that Andersen received the title of titular professor on 6th of October, 1851. I have not been able to find further details on this. Hence my second question, who, person, and what institution honored him with this title and why?
Yes, to the first question about the 1st of April, we briefly discussed it before this session, and none of us has ever heard about this debate. So it hasn't really been a debate in Denmark, and I guess it would have been if there had been any doubt about Andersen's birthday. Then I really can't fathom why this Dutch author should make up such a story about Andersen. But of course, there will be a birth certificate or some church protocols where the specific birth date of Andersen is recorded, and it's the 2nd of April. We're both very sure about that. So
I would add that if there had been any reasonable doubt about that, I'm sure it would have been a recurring debate in Denmark.
Sure, yes. And we've had some strange debates about Andersen, whether he was really the son of a king. And,
there are lots of rumors about Hans Christian Andersen.
Yes, but this one, no, never heard about it before.
Never heard. I can think of perhaps one thing that might, lead to this confusion is that Andersen actually, very coquettishly, had 3 birthdays. He had the first one, which was his real birthday on the 2nd of April, as far as we know. And then it was also common in among the Romantic artists, who all of them, of course, had to make the grand tour to Italy. It was very common to celebrate their Roman birthday. And this was I think it was Bertel Thorvaldsen, the famous sculptor in Denmark, who actually made this institution. So you would record the day you arrived in Rome at the first time on your grand tour, and then year after year, you would celebrate your Roman birthday. Andersen actually made a third one because he also celebrated the day that he arrived in Copenhagen for the first time. So he was actually celebrating 3 birthdays every year. So I think that might have created this kind of confusion.
Until only a couple of unbirthdays remained. Yes.
The thing about the titular professor, I don't know if you...
He was awarded this title, not, I think, by one specific person, but by the University of Copenhagen, recognizing him as an important cultural person and an important author. No obligations followed. He didn't have to teach or anything. It was simply an honorary title. Awarded him, by the University of Copenhagen.
It was a common thing in the 18th and 19th century in Denmark that honorable people could be awarded with this title.
Right, then there's a question from Pilar Barrera. I'd like to know more about the actential model and the actants. I'd also like to ask if the actential model and the home away home complement each other or are 2 different ways of analyzing a story.
Yes. About the first one, more about the actential model and the actants. I think that it's actually, as I recall, quite detailed what we are, or that is what there is in the what we are providing.
I kind of connected this question to the one about psychology, where you could say the actential model. It's really, the name underlines the fact that this is about action. So the idea behind the actential model is that it's the action in a tale which is what matters, and the object of the tale is really to narrate a narrative sequence which is a specific action. And the characters are merely functions of this action. Again, there is no kind of psychological depth. That's the idea of a model like this one. Characters are only there to bring the action about. And what they do is all that matters, and that's also why they're called actants.
And then I don't know if we can say that it's a structuralist model based on the reading of a lot of fairy tales, and then looking at all of these folk tales and then seeing some pattern or some kind of structure that goes through all of them.
So also the structuralist idea that all these different fairy tales, they're really telling one and the same story or one and the same action. No matter what different characters might be involved in different stories.
Well, and then you can add that these kind of structuralist models can be a very good opener of the text, but of course it can be very reductive to the text if you think that by locating these different kinds of actants and actions, then you have exhausted the text and you have understood its full meaning, because it will always require some further interpretation what's going on in the text. But it's a good opener, I find.
And then you could add that some point in the 20th century, then structuralism will kind of team up with Freudian psychoanalysis in the French psychoanalyst Lacan. So there you go. Psychology and structuralism joining forces in a way. but then again, the normal ideas of psychological development, they're totally alien to the Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And
there was
then,
the second part. Yeah.
Yes. Well, they complement each other, I think, those two models. Like when the subject succeeds in obtaining the object, then the subject will be able to fashion a new home.
Yeah.
You could say it that way. So it's the same kind of basic story addressed by both models.
Yeah.
But the home away home, it's kind of there is a temporality involved, a very simple one, but three stages in a temporal sequence where the actential model is completely atemporal.
Yeah.
I hope that was precise.
Then there is a question from Gil L, who asks, reading the tinderbox, I see that Andersen departed from the actential model, but I wonder why the soldier thought it necessary to kill the witch who had helped him gain wealth. It seems unjust and unchristian. The little blue light, on the other hand, provides an unjust king and an evil-minded witch, so it is more justified that they both die at the hands of the protagonist soldier.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Yeah,
I think. And there's already been some debate about also the blue light in the discussion threads during the first week. And some of you very rightly observe that the blue light is a very strange story. It doesn't quite fit the models. So you can find many folk tales who don't fit.
Yeah.
And you might be much more at a loss as to why that is the case than when you're dealing with an author like Andersen.
Yeah.
But the blue light is strange and somewhat sinister and uncanny in many ways. And the soldier in this story, why does he only want to use the princess as a kind of maid? And there are strange aspects of that story. And somehow it seems that Andersen's tale is much lighter. It's obviously based on a story like The Blue Light, but it appears to be much lighter, more children friendly. The soldier in Andersen's story seems to be a much nicer guy. Only he's a murderer, possibly a rapist, a mass murderer. And so really, what's going on here?
Yeah.
And you could say, well, Andersen is telling the story. It's a masterpiece in telling, because he's telling a horrible story about this horrible character in a way that makes him seem almost likable. And he can get away with telling this horrible story. And of course children like gory details often, and it's told in a way that children will accept the story. And adults have done too. In spite of what is going on, but a lot of you really reflect on what is going on, and like Jill here ask, well, it's possible. What's happening?
Because it does.
I think Andersen is really testing the waters. What can I get away with? Because he found out I could get away with anything,
with murder, literally. It does seem unnecessary that the witch is killed off, and the ending of the whole story is actually a bloodbath, but it's told in a way so that it doesn't seem as severe. It just, as I recall it just says that
it's like they break into pieces.
Like
so perhaps to the imagination of a child, it will be like they are dolls, wooden dolls that break apart. Like a doll might break apart if you drop it on the floor.
Like a like
so again,
finger dolls or something like that.
Marionettes or something like that. So the way it's told, makes it kind of acceptable.
But as I recall, Andersen, I think the use of a witch is a folktale element that he is incorporating, that he's using.
But Andersen is really exploring the kind of morality of folktales.
Yeah.
Or more modern ideas of his own age about folktales.
Yeah.
Like, well, we all agree that a witch is evil, and if she's ugly on top of that, we can just chop her head off, no big deal, right? Right? We accept it.
Yeah, exactly. And yes, this that might seem immoral from a contemporary. But maybe he is also exploring the immorality of the folktale.
Yeah,
through this. Because I don't recall that a witch appears later on. He leaves that witch trope, I think, later on in his authorship.
You have two witches in the Snow Queen.
Yeah.
There's a kind of benign witch who's only doing a little magic to amuse herself.
But she's called
the Snow Queen.
Yes.
And the Snow Queen is not designated as a witch.
No. And the benign is called the lady who knew magic.
Yeah.
So she's not called a witch
She's
either.
Not called a witch.
No. So he somehow leaves this witch behind, I think, in his fairy tale, in order to make more complicated and not so unequivocal characters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but it's really also an exploration of what would appear to be the immorality of the folktale, and it's very thorough, and because we've also got this element of a folktale where there is often a kind of moral to a folktale. For example, what we refer to as the qualifying test, that the hero or heroine will have to prove to be a good person, who will then deserve the kind of lucky fate of the hero or heroine. For example, by sharing a loaf of bread with an old man or woman who then turns out to be the helper, and so on. So Andersen has the soldier give out some money to the poor, but it is mentioned in passing that he's also going to the theater and going for rides in the royal gardens, and then handing out some money to the poor.
And that is perhaps...
And he's already killed the witch.
Yeah, and he is kidnapping or having the dog kidnapping. So I think...
And then he's kind of exploring another characteristic of the hero or heroine of a folktale, namely resourcefulness.
Yes.
Yeah.
And opportunism.
Opportunism.
Yeah.
Which is a quality, but which can also be a negative quality, of course.
Yeah, because you can be ruthless and exploiting your surroundings.
And the real ruthless opportunist will appear in the shape of the shadow in this later tale by Andersen.
Yeah.
And it's kind of in the shadow you combine elements of the soldier from the tinderbox with elements of Little Klaus. In Little Klaus and Big Klaus, and put those two together in a much more sinister version, and you get the shadow.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Which also means that all of Andersen's tales are so tightly connected.
Yeah.
Like tales commenting upon tales, and motifs being further developed all the time, and so on. He really thought his whole output of fairy tales and stories as one work in itself.
Yeah, commenting on each other.
And it's so cleverly worked out.
Yeah, commenting on each other, developing the themes. Yeah, I'm thinking about the relation between the Little Mermaid and the Dryad, which is a much later fairy tale that's also exploring some of the same themes. So you could go and read the Dryad after you've read the Little Mermaid, and then you can see some kind of continuation or development of that theme.
Right, then there's a question from Janet P. Following from this, it would be interesting to hear what are considered to be Andersen's religious views. As Jill suggests, they seem to differ from those of a potential Orthodox Lutheran, target audience?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a big question.
That's a very, very big question, and something that researchers in the works of Hans Christian Andersen and the life of Hans Christian Andersen have also been very preoccupied with. And it's difficult to it's absolutely true that Andersen's Christianity really did differ a lot from those of a potential Orthodox Lutheran target audience. Although I'm not sure that the audience in Denmark was Orthodox Lutheran, because Christianity in Denmark in the 19th century is a very difficult thing to get hold of.
Yeah.
It was very complicated. There were several strands of Christianity in Denmark, and appeared new strands of Christianity at that time. I'm thinking about Grundtvig, of course, and Kierkegaard also. Different takes and interpretations of Christianity.
And of Lutheran Christianity.
Of Lutheran Christianity, yeah. We will get back to this when we get to the red shoes. But what a lot of these researchers have arrived at is that this Christianity of Andersen is a profoundly personal kind of Christianity, which is combined from different kinds of doctrines. While all being Lutheran, Lutheran. There were some things in Lutheran Christianity that he did not emphasize. Let's just say that. I've been working with Hans Christian Andersen in relation to nature, and Andersen several places in his books, in his novels, and in his especially in his novels, write that he finds that nature is just as direct a route to appreciating God as the Bible is, for instance. He even calls nature my great Bible, and he's very condescending in one of his travelogues towards a monk who is sitting right next to him in a carriage and reading his Bible, and he doesn't understand why Andersen doesn't understand why he's reading his Bible instead of just looking out the window on God's good creation. So this is a very personal understanding of God. And also Andersen was very, very interested in the natural sciences throughout his life. And he did not see that in any kind of opposition to his Christianity. So he didn't see the natural sciences and the developments and discoveries that they did in the 19th century as a threat to his kind of Christianity.
No, he even tried to be a kind of mediator.
Yeah.
Or that was his ambition.
Yeah,
especially with one of his novels.
It's called To Be or Not to Be.
That's an unambitious title.
No, yeah.
But I mean, we could return to the phrase from Andre's question. Could he be seen as embodying a 37-year quest for making sense out of life?
Yeah.
Yes, and also a quest to make sense out of religion.
Yeah.
I mean, different religious views, different understandings of Christianity, of Lutheran Christianity, will be tested, put to the test in various stories.
Yeah,
I think so. And if anything is consistent, it's a kind of basic Christian ethics. And I think I certainly wouldn't like to have to say whether it's more Lutheran than Catholic or anything of the sort. But there is a kind of Christian ethics. And I find there are some similarities to what would be the Christian ethics of Kierkegaard. But that I'll not go any deeper into that now. But that's not a program. It's something you can kind of reconstruct, for want of a better word, reconstruct from a number of tales. But in one of my favorite examples, we'll get to that, is the scene from The Snow Queen, where Gerda kind of avoids answering the question of the robber girl about how much is Kai worth, or was he really worth all the trouble she's been going through. And the way Gerda goes about that question, I think that embodies an ethics. But not everybody will agree with me, I know. So, but there'll be time for that discussion later.
I completely agree that there is some kind of Christian ethics, which is also tied into an overall. If you want to read some kind of, I don't know, some kind of overall morality or something out of the out of the whole body of work, it's, I think, some kind of humanism, tolerance, accept of people who are different and people who are poor, a sympathy and solidarity with the lower classes, and not wanting to ostracize or demonize people for being a different social class, a different ethnicity, a different kind of religious belief. One of my favorite passages in this regard is also, I believe, from the travelogue I was referring to before, which is called The Poet's Bazaar. At some point, he is back in Rome again for the second time, and he doesn't care a lot for the stagings of Catholicism. Even though he finds himself very drawn to it, he thinks that it directs your attention away from the main thing, which is this address to God, or this more direct relationship with God. But he also says directly after that I have the deepest respect for every religious person's way of approaching his or her God. So, and he really underscores that. And I think that's very telling of his approach to the more overall question of religion. Also in two of his novels, in Just a Fiddler and To Be or Not to Be, like we mentioned before, two of the most intelligent characters are Jewish women, Naomi and Esther, who are constantly engaging in theological debates with the protagonists, and have some very, very good points throughout these. So he is very interested in the question of religion from a personal point of view, but also from, I think, a theological point of view.
Yeah, and the best formulation on the poetics of the fairy tale in Andersen's entire oeuvre is uttered by Esther in To Be or Not to Be.
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yes. But as you mentioned, there's also this elements of a kind of a more basic humanism in Andersen, and values like tolerance and for that reason, some scholars see him also as an heir to the Enlightenment.
Yeah.
And a good case can be made for that too.
Yeah.
So it just adds to the complexity, and I think you make a very important point. It's so complex when it comes to questions of religion, this era. There's also a strand of atheism in the Enlightenment, and then the new materialist ways of thinking, philosophers.
Yeah.
So there's an atheistic element, and various approaches to Christianity as well. And Kierkegaard launches this very violent attack on not the Christian religion, but the Christian religion as it is being preached or transmitted in the church institution, the institution of the church. So there's also this very violent attack from Kierkegaard on official Christendom, as he refers to it. So you get all sorts of things, and there's so many debates, also debates about the immortality of the soul, and so in the intellectual circles that Andersen gained access to, you could say everything was up in the air, and all sorts of dogmas were being challenged.
Yeah.
And so that is the environment he gained access to, that he entered.
And Andersen was very aware of these debates, and he well, To Be or Not to Be is really the novel if you want to see how Andersen was positioning himself in these debates. And from that novel, we can see that he, among other things, he read the German materialists that you just mentioned, which was a completely atheist materialist understanding of the world that spread from Germany during the 1850s and 60s, I believe, and that Andersen was to some extent drawn to, but also wanted to. He still was a Christian and wanted to kind of fuse this this almost positivist paradigm with Christianity. We also know from that book that he read Feuerbach, and he quoted Feuerbach directly, the big critic of religion and Christianity.
And in other ways, orthodoxy was being challenged from within the humanities at this point in time.
Yeah.
The whole idea of reading the Bible historically, philologically, it's around the year 1800 that endeavor starts, and it's a major challenge to the official church. So all sorts of things going on.
And let me just say, the killing of a witch in a fairy tale is the least of the problems in this respect when it comes to the question of Christianity in Denmark in the 19th century. Then we have a question also from Janet P. In 1.7, it is stated that Hans Christian Andersen challenges the conceptions and genres of Romanticism. Please, can you explain more about this? How did German Romanticism and Bildungsroman influence Hans Christian Andersen's life and fairy tales?
That's another big question.
Yes.
Very big. Very big. Well, I think you can say that German Romanticism is simply where Andersen starts as a writer. Some of his main influences are writers related to German Romanticism. Hoffmann, Tieck, and Heine is a bit later and not a romanticist in that sense, perhaps. But the writers who are, apart from Walter Scott, the writers who are most important to him are writers from the German Romantic movement. So this is where he starts. We say he challenges conceptions and genres of Romanticism. I think you have to make the qualification. This challenge also comes from within Romanticism itself. Romanticism is the challenging of Romanticism. And that's one reason why it appeals to Andersen. And this is, he kind of takes it from there. I think you. And what do I mean when I say that? Well, the questions of genre are not dogmatic to the Romantic writers. They will challenge questions of genre. They'll mix genres, something which has inspired Andersen immensely. I'm sure about that. But then there's, of course, the discovery of the child, discovery of the imagination as the most important human faculty, the discovery of nature as something other than just something for men to exploit. All these important Romantic ideas are inspirations to Andersen, but he will also test them and question them in his own way. But there are crucial ideas related to the Romantic breakthrough, which is it's still a paradigm, or they are still paradigms for us today.
I completely agree. I think to the extent that he is a Romantic, he's also a very late Romantic. So it is second, if not third generation.
But I think Romanticism is, as I say, the challenge to Romanticism comes from within Romanticism itself, which means that Romanticism is one of those movements that become post like this.
But however, I would add that in Denmark, Romanticism takes on a very...
It took a while.
It took a while, but then when it arrived, and it does so, I believe it's in 18...
And in a way, it never arrived. but
no, not
not everybody will
not
agree
the
with me when I say that.
original Romanticism, the original German Romanticism, but we do get some influence by a natural philosopher called Henrik Steffens, who is famously having he has a lecture in in the middle of Copenhagen.
He's introducing the gospel according to Schelling.
According to Schelling, who is drawing on Spinoza and a very monist universalist understanding of Romanticism. So this is this is high universal nationalistic Romanticism that is introduced in Denmark, and it has a huge impact on art and literature in Denmark, not least because we have some arbiters of taste, Johann Ludwig Heiberg, among other people, who are, and also within the painting art, there is also some professors on the art academies that are saying this is the way we should start painting and writing about things, and that results in a very, very idealistic, universalistic, nationalistic Romanticism in Denmark, which is also today referred to as the Golden Age. And that's just one interpretation of Romanticism as it was originally conceived in Germany, in where it was, to begin with, much more ironic, much more ambivalent, and it kind of loses some of that in the translation into Danish art and literary circles. But Andersen continuously keeps that dark undercurrent,
and so sometimes so cleverly that it hasn't really been discovered.
But if you, and that might also tie into the question about the Bildungsroman, if you look closely at his travelogues, that is perhaps some of the texts where he tries to be most romantic, but all of the time he is very aware of writing as a romantic and is continuously writing about that. Now I am writing as a romantic. That's almost what is always said somehow, or and that is in itself an ironic gesture.
Yeah, it is.
So it is he is inspired by Romanticism, but the original dark and ironic Romanticism of Germany.
Yeah, but you also, when we get to the tale translated as The Spectre and then The Traveling Companion, you can see elements of Romanticism in The Spectre, which are left behind in The Traveling Companion. The whole meta-thematization of the romantic imagination and the king being the king of hearts and so on is skipped in The Traveling Companion.
Yeah.
So elements of Romanticism, of being a romantic writer, are kind of left behind there. But the Bildungsroman is not really a romantic genre.
No, it's...
And I mentioned in one of the discussion threads that the prototype, more or less, would be Wilhelm Meister's Lehrjahre, written by Goethe. And Goethe is, of course, a bit earlier than the romantic breakthrough. And he hovers somewhere between late Enlightenment and Romanticism, and he didn't want to be considered, one of those young, flippant romanticists. They would very much like him to back them and to join the movement, but he didn't really want to. And somehow the Bildungsroman is about integration. Like you start at home and you have to go through this crisis and sow your wild oats in order to mature, and then you can marry and become a stable citizen and a good father. At least that's a cliche about the Bildungsroman. So it's about the importance of sowing your wild oats, but also about being eventually integrated in, you could say, bourgeois society. What, to return to that, what in some respects Andersen never really succeeded in doing, or never really wanted to do. And something that it breaks down. He wouldn't be able to write a traditional Bildungsroman of integration.
No, maybe he tries in the Improvisatore, which actually does have that kind of ending. But I think a lot of people agree that is so forced, that ending, that you can't really consider
and
it.
already, and then the next one, or is it the third one? Oh, in Only a Fiddler, at least it breaks down.
It really does break down.
It really breaks down.
In a very, very lethal way.
Yes.
Yeah. So that might be the only one, the Improvisatore, where he's actually trying to follow this this Bildungsroman.
Yeah.
But it's just too incongruent in many ways, and too unmotivated, the ending, I think, for it to be a successful Bildungsroman.
I can see there's some new questions. One again from Andrei. You just mentioned themes which reoccur from tale to tale. Maybe you could name several of these recurring themes, and maybe there's even a system of themes by which all the Andersen tales, roughly, can be classified. Would you recommend some reading on such a classification if this question was raised in the literature on Andersen?
If I can just start with the recommendation, I don't know if it's so much as a theme as it is a subgenre within the authorship, but the fairy tales of things is something that we sadly couldn't really find any place for in this course. But those are very, very very good. And that is by the fairy tales of things, I mean all those, I think it's 16 that's agreed upon, the 16 fairy tales that have things as the protagonists and as the main characters or actants of the story. Those are very good and humorous and funny. So they are very good reading. What would you think about themes?
I don't think you could make a kind of a final classification or catalog of themes, and I don't think that has been done, and certainly not in any works that would have been translated into English, for example. But I mean the dichotomy between what appears to be natural and what appears to be super artificial is certainly a theme taken up again and again in various contexts. And the theme of what will count as a good or a worthy deed matters of social the problems of social interaction is a theme that occurs again in very much in the the need for mutual recognition and the way that recognition between subjects will break down for one or the other reason. That's a theme, massive theme in Andersen.
I think
and it's from his position in the periphery or whatever I mean he was such a good reader of social interaction.
So are you thinking about communication between classes, for instance?
It's
like you find them in Clumsy Hands and The Swineherd and there are several, because I think if you want some fairy tales put on these classifications,
and also kind of the problems of the narrow mind, that theme pops up again and again and again. Kind of you only know the backyard where you grow if you're a plant, and you think that's the entire universe. And you can only understand things from the perspective of being this specific plant or whatever that you are.
So this kind of self-chosen ignorance that you also find in The Emperor's New Clothes, and also the Emperor in The Nightingale. I was also thinking about recurring theme, which is, as I mentioned earlier, solidarity with the poor, which is, the most known is perhaps the Little Match Girl, obviously. Then there is, I think, an interesting theme that is also sometimes recurring, which is this interest in the natural sciences. And there are some outliers in the world of the fairy tales, and it's mostly some of the later fairy tales, where you could mention The Drop of Water, which is about a scientist looking at a drop of water in a microscope. There is The Great Sea Serpent, which is about the telegraph cable that is sunk into the Atlantic Ocean between England and the US. There are also, these are very scientifically engaged and excited stories. There's also one called In 1,000 Years, in which Andersen is writing about mass tourism and blimp tourism during the next couple of centuries. So that I would also say that's a recurring theme.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, Andrei has posted one more. Oh, I think it's a very good question. Andersen's irony. What meanings and kinds of irony, for example, romantic irony, would you associate with Andersen? If I start up answering that one, well, it's especially romantic irony if you're talking about the young Andersen. I mean, this is really where he starts. It's with the romantic breakthrough, and it's also with the irony pertaining to the romantic breakthrough. And romantic irony is self-conscious irony that will sometimes mean breaking the illusion in one way or another, and the narrative voice being very conscious of itself, ironizing itself, ironizing what is being told.
Yeah.
And Andersen will do that again and again.
Yeah.
In his early works. Not so much in the fairy tales, in fact, but in his early travelogues and other plays. One of his very early plays leaves it up to the audience to decide how the play is going to end. They can almost have a referendum in the theater. And I mean, that's romantic irony.
Yeah.
And his early kind of arabesque rhapsody fantasy, Journey on Foot, the final chapter consists merely of punctuation marks.
Yeah.
And the reader can put in the words between the punctuation marks as the reader pleases and finish the book in that way. So that's the, and also this kind of self-conscious play is so pertaining to many of Andersen's, especially early poems. But then later on, his a much more sophisticated irony, which is much less conspicuous, but also related to the encounter of the author with the unpredictability and untrustworthiness of language. Which is where it gets really dangerous. Yeah.
So it's irony or romantic irony in a more linguistic way. I
wouldn't say linguistic. It's just the idea that there is no safety net under us.
Yeah.
As when we communicate with each other through the medium of language.
Oh yeah. I get what you mean.
It's not linguistic.
No. Another. Would you call it irony? Because I just thought of another theme that is also appearing in all kinds of his stories is the I don't know if that's the correct word, but the impermeability of writing, the way that writing is on the one hand something immaterial, a story, and on the other hand something very material that can be lost. Or get thrown away, or be used as some kind of wrapping around things. He is returning to that idea.
That's
all
a kind
the
of
time.
materialist version 2.0, you could almost say, of romantic irony.
Yeah. I would say so
Yeah,
too.
that's
That
that's very interesting. Yeah.
there's a play with the writing as a medium that somehow, and it very often a story will get thrown out, or some kind of literature will be thrown out in one of his fairy tales, or you have the fairy tale from the dustbin where it has been just thrown out.
Yeah. And then there's a much more simple irony, the thematic irony of the narrow mind believing itself to be the center of the universe, when it's really occupying a position somewhere in the periphery.
That's something you will often find in the fairy tales of things. All these things are very terribly conceited and self-important and full of themselves and believe themselves to be the center of the universe, which I read as allegories over human arrogance a lot of the time, that we shouldn't think ourselves so important. So there's also that kind of irony. But I agree that in the beginning of the authorship, it's very much a very, very nuanced understanding of romantic irony. And I think that the reason why he employs it is to make sure that we never end in some kind of moral, some kind of clear moral. There always has to be something that's withheld somehow, or something that's nuanced, or something that kind of breaks this clear interpretation that you might have of this story. I also think it's reflected in his work process, where, as I've understood it and as I've seen his redactional process, when he makes the final editing of a text, he will usually take something away. He will usually cross out the last 5 lines or something like that, in order for it to seem more ambivalent and more open.
More open to interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've got a student writing his thesis at the moment, studying manuscript stages towards the final version of one of Andersen's tales. I think the point is, all the changes being made work towards more openness to interpretation.
Yeah.
So that's a very consistent and strategy. And it's a very important observation.
Yeah. I think that's also worth bearing in mind during this course when we read Hans Christian Andersen, that if to the extent that the intention of the author matters when we read, then this, I think there's several times when Andersen writes, who knows what the world will make of my things in 200 years. So he was very aware and intended that his things should be read in a lot of different ways, and aware of the fact that there are no one true reading of a text, that it can be read in many different ways. And I think that he himself actively worked with that in mind, that this should be as open as possible and open to a lot of different interpretations.
Yeah. All right. I think we are through the questions.
Yes.
And it's been a pleasure. And so thank you very much for your attention, for watching this now, or if you're watching it later, and thank you for all the really interesting questions.
Yeah. We'll be looking forward to chatting with you on the forum.
Sure.